I hope you can appreciate that it is an extraordinarily difficult task to try to wrap up the just rich depth of discussion that we've had, all the points that have been raised in this wonderful two-day workshop. So let me just start off by thanking everybody, thanking the speakers, the experts representing multiple stakeholder groups. I think they were uniformly excellent. The audience, apparently there are over 2,000 of you that listened in, and I thank you for your attention. The committee, again, I won't read everybody's name, but I think you saw most of them during the moderation, and both in the preparation and the moderation. I think, again, there was a really high bar, and I really thank them for the considerable effort that went to pull this together. The National Academy of Staff, Sarah, Beachy, Siobhan, Addie, Meredith, Lydia, and Aaron did a fabulous job. I think you can imagine that the logistics of a workshop like this are tremendous, and they kept us all on task and ended up with a wonderful product. And of course, the NIH, which is the sponsor of this workshop, Taunton Payne, Ellen Wan, and Lyric Jorgensen for all of their work. So again, a big round of thank yous for everybody who participated in this. So I quickly wanted to go through today's session, just like I did with the morning sessions, just to give you some wrap up and some thoughts. There was an emphasis, or if you even remember back from this morning, because the discussion has been so rich, but we had a session on the value and costs of managing and sharing data. And there are a lot of key points that were brought up in this one. There's data management. We often don't necessarily define what data is and what data needs to be managed, but research processes and workflows are obviously very, very critical. And that was a theme that kept returning over and over again. This is one that I think also I will bring up again in my closing thought, but that data management in the laboratory is really a gateway to developing a culture of data sharing, because this is the place where we could see that clear value was appreciated by the research community, and therefore we can change the culture of data management and data sharing by making sure that there are working solutions. This is something that I would changed in my closing thought, but that I think the units in which we think that we're operating has been on the individual level. But it's really clear that if one wants to establish a culture of data sharing, you have to share it with someone or with something else. And so therefore, focusing on individuals may not be the right necessarily unit here, but perhaps we ought to be thinking about research groups, departments, institutions, cohorts, and even individual laboratories, which can be always have multiple individuals in them. In this way, we'll be able to understand discipline-specific needs, and they will have a way of adopting the sort of practices that we're talking about. There was a sharing benefit that wasn't emphasized yesterday, but I thought it was rather critical, and it was also germane to the discussion we just had, which is that public data drives the development of better analysis methods. We had a really good example of that in genomics. And of course, AI, artificial intelligence, is just hungry for data, and there's an extensive use of public data for that. And when we talk about equity issues and representation in data, this is why data sharing requires that, to ensure that data and all individuals are represented. Very clear, again, that models from outside biomedicine needs to look outwards, NIH needs to look outwards, and that there are numerous tools and approaches out there that can be helpful in navigating our very difficult waters. And so we heard about differential privacy and thinking of an economic model around data as an asset. And we also, this economic model talked about whether these are normal economic goods and rival risks or non-rival risks. And we saw that the equations were very complex there. We also had an excellent presentation to sort of think about this issue of reuse. We're always talking about reuse in order to drive to discovery science, so that someone takes a data set and reanalyzes it. But we saw that there was a lot of comparative data reuse in there, that people used it for all different types of things. And when we discuss impact of data sharing, I think we need to be able to consider all of those uses. At the same time, there certainly is, in certain fields, a data creator's advantage, and that provoked actually a lot of discussion on the internal chat about what is necessary in those cases. Is it the case that all data needs a human phone number there to someone to call to be able to use it? We know that that's not true. There's a large use of large public data sets, but it's probably true that humans are more important in more cases than we think about. And how do we manage that whole process? And there was an interesting discussion about costs, right? Are they funded by direct or indirect costs? How are these managed? And I think, again, an overarching theme is that we have data on data sharing, as I said this morning, but it's clear that we need more. And studies of practices and attitudes and researchers are very valuable in navigating this culture change, not just researchers, but in the funding agencies themselves. So we certainly need more study of this field to be effective. Some takeaways from session 5, which was called Shaping a Culture of Data Sharing. That was a very interesting ethical perspective on sharing of data. There's a lot of issues I know that I myself hadn't thought of, and I'm sure that was true of you as well. There's clear that new regulations will always impact what data should be shared and how they can be shared, and this will be a moving target. And so whatever structures we have need to respect the fact that the regulatory environment for this will probably never be fixed as our algorithms and uses of data change. But I did like this statement, which says, rather than talk about data ownership, because that's a huge issue in sharing, do I have the rights to share this data? It says, let's focus on who has the rights to do what with the data. So rather than the sort of strict issue of ownership. Data governance, again, another term that came up over and over again are guardrails. And I also added some signage there, right? That data governance is not a carrot or a stick, but it is a set of guardrails that help us, and perhaps some signage that points our way as where to go next. So the community can have input on these guardrails and signage, but these things need to be widely distributed. Trust, again, is a term that will show up over and over again because trust promotes, encourages reuse. But we also injected in this particular session, I think, the issue of values. And the question was raised, what values are we trying to promote through data sharing? And it was certainly brought to my attention that there are, in fact, fair information practice principles that have been in use for a very long time, but as we heard, did not really impact biomedicine. So we really do need to pay attention to all of this. We also started to have some focus, which was brought up again in the last one, about the ethical principles that govern research participants, and that the focus is not always on an individual, but often a group, that these communities deserve our respect, and we cannot be blind to people and their interests that are behind our research. So how can we build trust that is trustworthy? I thought that was or trust institutions that are trustworthy, I thought it was a really important point. Funders need tools too. That really came out. There was a focus on the second day. The first day was really researchers and institutions, but the second day is that the funders, if we're going to have a cultural change, it's a cultural change inside the funding agencies as well, and they will need to have tools if they're going to monitor this. So we certainly want to be able to reward good data sharing practices. In order to be able to do that, funders need to know who has good data sharing practices. And so there were a lot of specific examples that were brought up around that. This last session, I think we have fewer points just because we were so busy listening, we couldn't necessarily type them fast enough, but are we ready for 2023? Again, it's quite clear that managing and sharing takes a village. And I like the statement, if we create those communities, then we can create the practice of sharing and managing data inside those communities. So again, what is the unit that we want to really target here? So support for training and putting learning into practice is key. NIH needs to use all of their processes to support the policy. Again, what does the staff need? The successes of these policies will be focused on advancing research to drive health. We certainly don't want to lose track of that. And we need to be able to, as we heard in Letitia's last presentation, integrate and embed equity into all aspects of data management and sharing. So I wanted to, whoops, what happened to my previous slide? Some overarching thoughts. I wanted to share some of my overarching thoughts. Some of them I just brought up, so I may go through some of these quickly. But I agree with Neil that the tenor of the conversation around data sharing has changed. Again, maybe if we had a lot more researchers on the panels, it would be more about the negatives, but it really wasn't that. We know that this is coming. We know that it is in fact going to be here in 2023 on a much wider scale. The journals and others have already been pushing this. So it's more a desire that the data sharing that we do be impactful. And that may not be a blanket, we share everything all the time. We have to sort of understand what is going to be effective, but that is something that we can only really do, I think, by doing. Again, data management is the gateway to data sharing. That came through loud and clear, that if you can share amongst your lab and you can share amongst your colleagues, then sharing amongst the wider community becomes that much easier. So reproducibility really requires that data be structured in a way that it can be shared. It's integral to good practice. There's a truly breathtaking body of work, tools, and experience that can be drawn upon as we seek to change the culture, right? So when we say that we need to learn by doing, it's not that we don't have some of those guardrails already in place. We have a huge body of work that we can draw upon, and it will be difficult, as we know. We're not sugarcoating this, but in fact, that should give us some reassurance, right? That as we go through this, that a lot of thought has already been put into that. Again, a lot of that body occurs outside of biomedicine, and we need to take that into consideration. And I do actually want to mention something that I don't think was brought up officially, which is the NIST research data framework that's really trying to tackle a lot of these issues on a system-wide scale. Trust and respect, it kept being brought up over and over and over again. It's at the heart of data sharing, but it needs to be earned. And I think that that was the message that really came through. And we see in the area of data that a difference in trust will have asymmetrical results. It will impact data sharing and its effectiveness in very practical ways, as we mentioned with AI and tools, but also in societal ways and ethical ways as well. And I think this was another point that, again, I think I've touched on. Culture change needs to be system-wide. All participants need to have their point of view shifted, and that includes the funding agency. So when measurement tools are needed, better data management tools are needed, but that is all across the board. And I don't know if you can see down at the bottom because people are covering this, but it always strikes me when I'm in these conversations and workshops about data sharing, it's often about FAIR, which emphasizes machine readability, but human expertise is still important. And as Christine showed us, that is actually distributed. So Richard, I had put together this very nice diagram last night that really talked, that I think made the point that the system really must shift to change culture, and that culture change will in fact shift the system. And I don't know, Richard, if you'd want to pop on and say anything more about this.
I'll say quickly that I heard many different models of the system, and it can be an onion, it can be other shapes. But I think it involves a lot of different groups. And in order to make the system work, whether it be about sharing, whether it be about good science, or about equity, it requires moving all these groups together. And so the PI I have centered here, others have said that the infrastructure is the key, but I'd just like to point out that we must align incentives internally to near PIs in their labs, external incentives, funding groups, publishers, reviewers. We have to align the leaders who talk about what good science is and how to make science reliable and strong, influential. And finally, in order to get this done, we have to make it reasonably easy for the scientific community. We have to give them the training, the tools, the infrastructure, and data management infrastructure as well. So we heard a lot of other ideas that has to be included into this mix, particularly equity. And but what I'm looking forward to is how each of you suggests new ideas for both the system and what's important to make it work. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's see, I think there are a few more slides here. First, I did want to give a shout out to the work that's underway in FASEB. We learned about this a little bit too late to get it on the program, but it is good to see again that we talk about the systemic culture change, and societies like FASEB are really taking this to heart and trying to foster a culture of data reuse. And they have a data management and sharing task force and are making very concrete recommendations and tools available to their communities to help us seek this culture change within their own constituency. And I think we'll start to see more of that as a result of the policy and also, again, the breadth of expertise that we now have available. So just some final thoughts here, some considerations for NIH. And I think Phil said we know we're not ready, but can we be more ready? Which I thought was a really good way to put it. And I don't want to read through all of these because I know we're a little bit over time. But I think we tried to capture here a lot of the ideas that are very, very specific, because of course one wants to be able to act on a lot of these recommendations. And clearly prioritizing projects that focus on data reuse is good. Figuring out what to do with the failed experiments, how do we promote that as well? Because in the data world, those are really important data points. Data citation, we know needs more work, but if we start to adopt that as the research community, if we value it, we'll see that infrastructure change a lot more quickly. Digital object identifiers and persistent identifiers in general. We know that we want to be able to track things. We want to be able to measure things. In the FAIR world, it's these digital object identifiers, these unique identifiers that make that possible and easy. So if funders want tools, we really do need to promote the use of these inside them. More attention on the data management plan. We talked about that. Clarifying funding sources for data sharing and management. We know that this is going to cost money. It was a question raised of how much money and whether we had that much money to devote to it. But I think that really does need to have some clarifications of what it is that we're expecting institutions to do and researchers to do. Assist disciplinary organizations and societies like FASAB and others in facilitating fair sharing. I think making sure that we upgrade the data management and sharing infrastructure across medicine, biomedicine is really clear that such a thing is needed. In the past, we've had huge investments in the physical infrastructure in terms of universities and instrumentation and labs. We may need to think about something similar for the data management and information IT infrastructure as well. Clearly a need for more data on data sharing, studying practices, tracking costs, providing examples. Dealing with guide rails of how we can operate is really important, and requesting tangible evidence of respect for data sharing. Like, for example, Neil gave some examples. BioSketch should include a contribution to data sharing, right? And again, addressing data sharing broadly at the NIH itself by giving clear guidelines to NIH staff and the tools that they need. So I just want to leave you, oops, I keep skipping slides. What does success look like? We had a chance to sort of think about this in the very first round, and we touched on it in the last session as well. And I want to leave you guys with this so that you can think about this in yourselves, in your own communities. If we're saying that it takes a village, it takes everybody, then everybody needs to start thinking about what success looks like in your little slice of the world, right? Your little part of the world. And I think, obviously, we want growing more proportions of publications that have background data, and not just in a data availability statement, but in a way that it can be tracked. So we want to go from 1%. The next time we have a workshop like this, we would like that to be much higher. We want everyone to take an active role in developing a culture of data sharing. We want to see increased value put on data by researchers themselves and the institutions, the societies, the journals, and the funders, really treating it as a first-class object. We'd like data to be born fair. We want to see an increase in the reuse of shared data. And we want to see more impact, obviously, that new careers and new industries are launched, and increased reuse of data sharing, of shared data across the enterprise. That we start to share best practices, and we start to make those available, not just for those who are in the know or the echo chamber, as Phil talks about, but widely across biomedicine. That we have sustainable repositories with data. We know that that is a struggle. And there was really a talk again about respect for the people who make all of this happen, who often struggle in career paths inside of the university and are not always awarded the respect that they need. So we would like to see that as well. And we'd like to see that inside biomedical enterprise, that these investments lead to more effective data management, right? That it's easier for people to share, and that they are seeing the value themselves in the way that they do their own work. And finally, again, that biomedical data starts to operate with a clear set of guardrails and signposts for ethical and just sharing of information, and that trust and respect that we talked about are the norms. So I thank you very much, again, really, for all of you who have listened in, for all the speakers, for providing so much food for thought. And I apologize that I couldn't do justice to everything that was said, but I just wanted to give a few notes about what's next after this workshop. So again, the workshop materials and videos will be posted to the website in a couple of weeks, so you should be able to see all of that. We really hope you'll take some time to fill out a post-workshop survey that was sent by email today to let us know how you thought the workshop went. And really, again, the stakeholders at all levels are encouraged to think about the challenges discussed over the last 2 days to help move this field forward. And that includes everybody who participated in this conference and other stakeholders that we may not have represented. So once again, thank you so much for participating with us.